bought their oil company. The British Oil Company was actually originally an antique dealership called Shell. And the Dutch company, Royal Dutch, bought Shell and had 51% controlling interest. So at that moment then, there's essentially two mega oil companies on the planet. The reason there's only two is because the United States has been overrun by a single oil company. One oil company has taken out all the other ones, and it's Standard Oil. So by the end of the 19th century, Standard Oil owns 95% of the US oil industry, and Royal Dutch Shell dominates the rest of the world, although Standard Oil is going overseas too, so it's these two companies. Britain has had a long intertwined history with the Dutch, especially after William of Orange becomes King of England. And so it's not that the Dutch are their enemy, and of course they have a good relationship with us, so it's not that we're their enemy. This isn't, they're not worried about, oh, at some point the Dutch and the United States will betray them. They're worried about what happens if something happens to the Netherlands, what happens if the United States elects some nut job president and they derail themselves. We can't rely on others, we have to rely on ourselves. And they're thinking you can make a lot of money off of oil if we're right that oil is the future. Up with a genius idea. What if you just read a bunch of history? And as you're reading the history books, you'll find a reference to prior use of oil. And then once you find that reference, then you just go to that place and look for oil. Because in the end of the 19th century, the way you look for oil is you looked at the ground and then you just went for a walk. If you got really lucky, you stepped in it and it swish. There was so much oil on the planet, you could just step in it. Isn't that weird to think about? But odds are you're not going to get that lucky. What you're then looking for is black shale or black limestone. Those are really porous rocks. They'll pull the oil that's underneath into them, and they'll go black. And that means there's probably oil there. And the way you got to the oil was a shovel and a pick. And you literally dug a well, like you would dig a water well. And hopefully, there's a little bit of pressure and the oil has just come into the surface on its own. So that's what the Brits need to do. The problem is, where to even start? The planet's big, they own a huge chunk of it, but it's still big. And so the history books give them the answer. 1,000 years ago, the Middle East lit its streets up at night using oil lamps, which meant that medieval Arabs had oil, which meant there was probably oil somewhere in the Middle East. So that's where they decide to start looking. In anticipation of this, the Brits decide to expand their presence in the Arabian Gulf. Now, they already had, it's also called the Persian Gulf. I'm using the Arabian Gulf in this particular case because at the time the Brits were using it that way. I'm not going to take sides in the argument about whether it's the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf. Perso-Arabian Gulf? No, it won't work. That's terrible. So the reason Brits have a presence already in the Arabian Gulf is the following. The Arab states that are today the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman had pirate fleets, and those pirate fleets were operating in the Arabian Sea, capturing British ships going back and forth between India and the British Empire. And it was driving the Brits absolutely bonkers. So in the early 19th century, the Brits either militarily engaged them or diplomatically engaged them, and they make a deal to get them to stop attacking British shipping. And one of the deals ends up, the British end up